So we are in chapter 6, the first chapter focusing on Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti. And it is, Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti means the practice of devotional service according to the rules and regulations. And so this, chapter 6, the first of the chapters in the section, is listing out all the rules. Yesterday we read through 20 of them, 2 groups of 10. The first group, they're all things you must do. And the second group, they're things you must not do. And then we read that, let me just read it again, that altogether Srila Rupa Goswami mentions 20 items, and all of them are very important. Out of the 20, the first 3, namely accepting the shelter of a bona fide spiritual master, taking initiation from him, and serving him with respect and reverence, are the most important. Okay, so now there are another 44 rules. There are another 44. We will run through them right now, the remaining 44. If you've got my PDF file, it may say 45 if you're using that. If you're using that, I'm sorry, it's a mistake. There's actually 44. All right, so what we'll do, we'll just go through the list of 44 and maybe say a little word or two on a few of them. But later on this evening, and probably in half an hour or so or whatever, something like that, we will move on to chapter 7, which is the first chapter in which there are more detailed descriptions of each of the 64 rules. Yes, we're going to go through every single one of them and make a little analysis of every single one of them. Okay, so here we go. Next rule. This is now number 21. One should decorate the body with tilak, which is the sign of the Vaishnavas. Prabhupada particularly said, if on your forehead you don't have tilak, Prabhupada said, your forehead looks like a graveyard. A graveyard. Prabhupada said that. Yeah. So yeah, it's like a sign of beauty even. Okay, number 22. When you do the tilak markings, sometimes you can write Hare Krishna on your body in tilak. 23. One should accept flowers and garlands that have been offered to the deity and the spiritual master and put them on one's body. 24. One should learn to dance before the deity. 25. One should learn to bow down immediately upon seeing the deity or the spiritual master. 26. As soon as one visits a temple of Lord Krishna, one must stand up after bowing down. 27. When the deity is being carried for a stroll in the street, a devotee should immediately follow the procession. 28. A devotee must visit a Vishnu temple at least once or twice every day, morning and evening. Now, we did mention last night that not all of these rules are compulsory. Like if you are out traveling for anything, but particularly if you're out on traveling Sankirtan, traveling book distribution, some traveling preaching program, and you're away from the nearest temple, then you cannot visit the temple once or twice a day, obviously. So what can you do? In order to facilitate your service, you may have to sometimes, or you may just not be able sometimes, to apply some of these rules, including the next one, which is 29. One must circumambulate the temple building at least 3 times. So if you're nowhere near a temple, then obviously you can't do that. Can you just phone him and ask him if it's all right? Yeah. So number 30, one must worship the deity in the temple according to the regulative principles. 31, one must render personal service to the deities. And we have a special question, a special point to note here in regard to rendering personal service to the deities. Let us just read a little excerpt from a class of Prabhupada's on Bhagavad Gita chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. Prabhupada says, therefore, the deity worship is very important. If you're engaged in deity worship, you always get the impression of Krishna and Radharani. And if you think of Krishna and Radharani always within your heart, then you become the topmost yogi. Let me warn you, write it down. All right, you get me? Write it down. Yeah, you got it. All right, because you may or you will be asked a question on that. All right. Okay, we carry on. Number 32, one must sing. I mean, some of them do overlap, at least to some degree, because the next one, 33, one must perform Sankirtana, which, often or generally involves singing. Or, of course, you can distribute books, that's also Sankirtana. And then 34, one must chant. Prabhupada, when we go through the more elaborate explanations, Prabhupada refers to this as japa. This is now japa, number 35, or number 15 of the last 44. Of the last 44, it's number 15. Number 14. The number 15, one must offer prayers of one's own. Because 16 is, one must recite notable prayers. Means not of your own, but from some great devotees. Notable, famous prayers like Brahma Samhita, for example. Then number 37 or 17, one must taste Mahaprasad. Number 18, 38, one must drink Charanamrita. 39 or 19 of the last 24, one must smell the incense and flowers offered to the deity. Number 40 or number 20 of the last 44, one must touch the lotus feet of the deity. 41, one must see the deity with great devotion. Actually, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to follow the numbering as it appears in the book. Means here, this last 44, they're just taken as one group. So they start from 1 and go to 44. Okay. So where were we? 21, one must see the deity with great devotion. 22, one must offer arati at different times. 23, one must hear about the Lord and his pastimes from Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, and similar books. 24, one must pray to the deity for his mercy. 25, one should remember the deity. 26, one should meditate upon the deity. 27, one should render some voluntary service. 28, one should think of the Lord as one's friend. 29, one should offer everything to the Lord. 30, one should offer a favorite article, such as some type of food or a garment. 31, one should take all kinds of risks and perform all endeavors for Krishna's benefit. 32, in every condition, one should be a surrendered soul. 33, one should pour water on the tulsi tree. 34, one should regularly hear Srimad Bhagavatam and similar literature. 35, one should live in a sacred place like Mathura, Vrindavan, or Dwaraka. 36, one should offer service to Vaishnavas, devotees. 37, one should arrange one's devotional service according to one's means. 38, in the month of Kartik, one should make arrangements for special services. 39, during Janmashtami, one should observe a special vow. 40, one should do whatever is done with great care and devotion for the deity. 41, one should relish the pleasure of Bhagavatam reading among devotees and not among outsiders. 42, one should associate with devotees who are considered more advanced. 43, one should chant the holy name of the Lord. And 44, one should live in the jurisdiction of Mathura. Okay, so Srila Prabhupada gives a summary, a conclusion at the end of the chapter. So before we go on to the next chapter, let's just read this. So Prabhupada says, now the total regulative principles come to an aggregate of 64 items. As we have mentioned, the first are the primary 10 regulative principles. Those are the do's, the things you must do. Then come the secondary 10 regulative principles. Those are the second 10, and they are the important do nots. Not the only ones, but they're the most important of the do nots. And then added to these are 44 other activities, what we just read the last so many minutes. So altogether, there are 64 items for discharging the regulative practice of devotional service. Now, here comes a very important point. Out of these 64 items, out of all of them, 5 items, namely worshipping the deity, hearing Srimad Bhagavatam, associating among the devotees, Sankirtana, and living in Mathura, are very important. I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. The 64 items of devotional service should include all of our activities of body, mind, and speech. As stated in the beginning, the regulative principle of devotional service enjoins that all of our senses must be employed in the service of the Lord. Exactly how they can be thus employed is described in the above 64 items. Now, Srila Rupa Goswami will give evidence from different scriptures supporting the authenticity of many of these points. What this means is that the next, how many is it? It's like 5, I think, 5 chapters or so, is going through one by one all of these rules and just elaborating a bit further, clarifying a bit further what is meant and how to do it and what the effects are. So the last thing I want to mention before we go on to chapter 7, the last thing is that we have, it is 4, you could say, 4 special groups of verses amongst all these 64. The first group is the first 10, all the do's. The second group is the second 10. The third group is verses 1, 2, and 3 in the first group. The first main group. Those first 3 are all in relation to the spiritual master. And then the fourth group of especially important verses out of all of these is the very last 4, which we just read. Actually, the very last 5, which we just read. Lord Chaitanya, when he explained all these things to Rupa Goswami, then there's one verse, actually to Sanatana Goswami. So he said, Sadhu Sangha, Nama Kirtan, Bhagavat Shravan, Mathuravas, Sri Murtir, Shradaya Sevan. This is in Chaitanya Charitamrita, and if you read through that verse, and then go through some of the following verses, you'll see how Lord Chaitanya emphasizes those last 5 verses, that we should worship the deity with great faith and veneration. We should relish the pleasure of the Bhagavatam among devotees. We should associate with devotees And particularly to help us progress, we should associate with devotees who are more advanced. Then we should chant the holy names and live in a sacred place like Mathura, Vrindavan, Dwaraka, Radha Radhanath Temple, like that. Yes, it's a fact. So these are very important. The first three, if you read carefully how Prabhupada expresses it, then you see that Prabhupada's saying that out of the first 20, those first three are of really special importance. But then Prabhupada said here very clearly, out of these 64, out of the whole 64, the last 5 are particularly important. Of course, we assume, well, at least for the devotees, we will perform those last 5 under the direction of the spiritual master. But if one does not have a spiritual master, or means really, if someone is not a devotee, if someone is just not a devotee, then, but somehow, if somehow they get engaged in any one, two, some, or all of those 5 activities, then they will become devotees. They'll become devotees in due course. And otherwise, for those who are devotees and who are practicing Krishna consciousness under the guidance of a spiritual master, well, they will focus on those activities under the supervision of the spiritual master. And just an interesting point to note, if we analyze what we are doing in Krishna consciousness, what do we do every day during the day, then we'll see that at least a substantial amount of the time we're doing one or two or some of those 5 activities. Here we are right now, and you could say if effectively we're hearing Srimad Bhagavatam. Basically, that's the idea. Yeah, some very sacred, authentic scripture coming in parampara. That's what we're doing right now. Shortly we'll see the Deity, just before we saw the Deity. And here we are in the association of devotees. So like this, it's very much there, very much part of Krishna consciousness, as given to us by Prabhupada, that we practice these 5, and sometimes all of them at the same time, or at least 1 or 2 or 3 like that. Okay, so now, devotees, we're going on to chapter 7, which is titled Evidence Regarding Devotional Principles. And this chapter covers the first 18 rules. The first 18. Okay. And then following chapter 8, which I am hoping at least we'll go through tomorrow. In fact, I am assuming we'll go through tomorrow. The following one, chapter 8, is focusing simply on the 19th rule, which is don't make offenses. The whole chapter 8, is simply focusing on that rule number 19. Anyway, we'll get there in due course. Okay, so let's have a look then in chapter 7, and we'll see. We see there's no introduction or anything like that. We're just straight into the rules. And the first one, of course, is accepting the shelter of a bona fide spiritual master. And, as we go through these, generally we'll find that, maybe not always, but I would say at least generally, there's at least one verse quoted in the description of each rule. Generally, there's at least one verse. Sometimes there's more than one verse. Sometimes there's a number of verses quoted to elaborate upon and illustrate the meaning and the significance of the particular rule in question. And just like you remember the previous few nights when we were going through those two chapters 4 and 5, in which it was pointed out that devotional service is superior to material life and liberation. You remember then, there were quite a number of verses, and I think generally we read through pretty much all of them, and they're all emphasizing those points. Devotional service is better than, you don't need to do anything other than devotional service, and it's better than material life and impersonal practice. But those different verses, it wouldn't be too hard for someone who's just sort of, kind of going through it in a cursory way, not really focusing and trying to really absorb it. It might be easy enough for such a person to think it's repetitive. We got all these verses, and they're more or less saying the same thing. Like there was between the two chapters, there's, I think, at least 20 verses, maybe there was 30. And someone might think, it's repetitive. Of course, to some degree there is, but at the same time, as we did point out then, each verse is giving a special perspective. Sometimes it might be a little subtle, but a particular perspective on the subject matter. So here, as we go through all of these different rules, please bear this in mind, that Srila Rupa Goswami, Prabhupada is basically presenting what Rupa Goswami has said and clarifying and elaborating. Generally, these verses have been selected by Srila Rupa Goswami as being particularly suitable for addressing the subject matter, the particular rule.